I'm Will Turnpenny. As Donna said, I'm the assistant head at Magdalen Gates Primary School, and we are right in the centre of Norwich. We're a one-form entry school, just under 200 pupils, and for Norwich, we've got a really diverse set of pupils in our school. We have over 28 different languages spoken within school. Our population is quite a mobile population, which means that we have children coming in and moving out of school quite frequently through the school year, and often they're children from families of different cultures. And so that's kind of where we're coming from. But more importantly than that, what that doesn't tell you is about the kind of wonderful children and families that make up our community, because in spite of that great diversity, I think one of the things that I love about this school and about working here is that there is a really cohesive, coherent community and a real sense of working together through things. So I want to share a little bit about our practice today, because whilst inclusion is incredibly important, sometimes it can also sound a little bit ephemeral and out there in the ether. So it's useful, I think, to share some practical things about what that means to us. Now, when I was thinking about what to talk about today, I reflected back on my own teacher training many years ago and on lessons that I was taught, but also perhaps some things that would have been useful to know at that time. And I've kind of boiled it down to three things that I'd like to talk to you guys about today. They're up on the screen, and it's three things that I think are important for you to do. And I'm going to take you through each one of those and also give examples from our practice and share some ideas about how you might work that into your practice. So first of all, I want you to teach your children and your pupils about inclusion. I think it's important that we do that explicitly, but also implicitly. And finally, that we model that in our practice. Now, I'm sure over the last day or two, you've probably had lots about what we mean by inclusion, but in education, you'll find, or I found, that there are some words that mean different things in the mouths of different people. You know, inclusion is really one of those words. So if you go back to the 1970s, just after the Warnock Report, it was all about integrating children with disabilities and special educational needs away from the specialist schools, which are often miles from their homes and communities, and into mainstream community schools. A little bit later on, it came to mean welcoming children regardless of their backgrounds, and sort of a bit of a broader idea of inclusion. There are other meanings like the opposite of exclusion, keeping children within the school community. And then there are some meanings which are sort of, I don't know, perhaps a little bit more disingenuous. So I know that over the past few years, we have seen quite a big rise in the number of schools using inclusion rooms or inclusion booths, where children are included in a room on their own to keep them in school. So all of that means that when we talk about inclusion, we're often talking about different things. For me, I found the most helpful idea of inclusion is the one that's pointed to by this lovely quote by Maya Angelou. Now, I would normally never read off the PowerPoint, but this one's perhaps not that clear to me, so I will just read it out. It says, "We all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what their colour." Now, I love that quote because particularly there's that emphasis on the equality of every single thread in the tapestry. But I love as well the idea of all those individual things coming together to form something bigger. In my first comments just then, I was talking about the idea of inclusion being welcoming children regardless of their background. But this quote speaks to something a bit more positive. It speaks to welcoming children and celebrating their backgrounds and their families and their cultures. And I think as educators, whether we're at primary or secondary or further education, it's important that our pupils and students see themselves reflected in the work that we're doing. It's important that when they go to school, they see that their own lives are being spoken about and they recognise things that they do. So I think that's a very important part of it. Now, when we talk about this, Some people will immediately see why we should be speaking to children about inclusion and teaching them about it. For some people, it will be the moral equivalent of an open goal. Of course, you should be doing it. But I am also aware that there are schools where there will be lots of pressure on timetables and curriculum and on fitting things in. And so you might need a little bit of a boost as to why you do that, beyond just the moral and ethical aspects of it. So I'm just going to quickly talk you through some reasons why I think it's important. First of all, there are quite a few legislative reasons why we need to be covering this with our children. So the Equality Act puts an equality duty on all organisations in the public sector to be protecting the 9 protected characteristics, that's different characteristics that people can have, which could lead to them being discriminated against. And that duty says that every public sector organisation needs to foster good relations between those who share a protected characteristic and those who don't. The Education Act talks about the importance of giving children a broad and balanced social, moral, spiritual and cultural education, and that later got cashed out with this idea of fundamental British values of democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, but also respect and tolerance. Finally, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has a lot to say about inclusion and how we speak to children about it, particularly Article 29, so Article 28, which is the right of children to have an education, and then Article 29, which says that that education should build respect for other people and the world around them. So for all those reasons, I think it is incumbent on schools to be teaching about inclusion and to be making that clear and applicable for their children's lives and relevant to the families that they've got in front of them. So that's teaching about inclusion. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is talk to you about how we teach about inclusion at our school. And a big part of this for us is that a few years ago, we decided to apply to become a school of sanctuary. Norwich is a city of sanctuary, and that means that it's a city that's been recognised for its work on welcoming asylum seekers, refugees, people from all sorts of places around the world, and making them feel welcome here. Now, the schools of sanctuary idea is that our schools should become beacons of that same sense of welcome and safety and inclusion. I'm not going to read through the slide on the screen. I'll give you a moment to read through it yourselves, though. So that set of 3 simple principles gives you some idea of what we're talking about when we say that we're a school of sanctuary and what we're aiming for. But it doesn't give you much idea about the practical details and how we do that. So I'm going to take you through that in the next couple of slides. And here's where I'm going to talk about explicitly teaching about inclusion and why we've chosen to do that through the lens of sanctuary and refugee status and asylum seekers. Partly, it's because those stories are ones that inherently spark an idea of compassion in our children and in our community. They are rich, interesting stories, and they're important. Whenever we talk about something like inclusion, it's important that it doesn't just become something that's an abstract concept. Instead, it should be something that can be applied in people's everyday lives. So, first of all, when we're explicitly teaching it, an important part of this is that we share texts and stories of real people that explicitly relate to seeking sanctuary or asylum. And there are so many good stories on this. Some of my absolute favourites on this screen at the moment. We've got The Boy at the Back of the Class by Anjali Ralph. We read that in year 4, and it's a wonderful text about a Syrian refugee coming to join a school in Britain. You will be probably familiar with 1 or 2 other texts here. I know that when I was at school, I studied Goodnight, Mr. Tom. But my absolute favourite of these is down at the bottom, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit by Judith Kerr. Now, she is the author of The Tiger Who Came to Tea. But in her childhood, she left Germany during World War II as a refugee and went to France and then the UK. And this memoir, one of 3 memoirs about her refugee journey is incredibly insightful about what it means to a child and what it feels like to be in a school, in a place that's different to your own, where a different language is spoken. So we use these stories to open up discussions and to get children to think and reflect on the experiences of people who are not able to stay in their home places. We also have participation in some bigger projects. For example, every year in June, there's a refugee week, and we join together with other schools to do a whole week of teaching specifically on this, where we'll be doing art activities, coming together as a whole school. We also partner with local charities. There's a fantastic one in Norwich called New Roots, who we do fundraising in partnership with, and get them to come and speak to us, have people come in and share their stories with us. And we work on some whole school projects, one of which I will share right at the end of this session. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea about how we explicitly teach about sanctuary, about different people's diversity and lives. Now I'm going to talk a tiny bit about reflecting the implicit messages of that, because a very sensible person said that in school, children are learning all the time, even when you're not explicitly teaching a curriculum. And if you're not explicitly or purposefully teaching something, I think it's important to be mindful of what you are inadvertently or unconsciously teaching children. And there are some ways that we can match that message of inclusion with our own practice. I'm not going to get you thinking too deeply about every single thing that you do, because you could drive yourself a bit mad with it. But the things that I'm going to talk through now are some simple ideas that might help you to clarify some key things that you can be doing. So first of all, this one, I'm afraid, is much easier for primary colleagues than it will be for secondary. Primary colleagues, I know that you've usually just got one class full of children. Maybe as you go up through the school, you'll be expected to know all children. But secondary colleagues, you will be speaking to all sorts of children throughout the day, many times the number that we have to speak to. But I can't stress this enough. It is so important to do your best to understand and learn the names of the children in front of you. And in particular, I want you to make sure that you learn how to say names that might be unfamiliar to you, and that you check those with the children in a discreet way. And that's simply because our names are so important to us, and it's a profoundly alienating experience to be called by something different or not quite the right pronunciation of your name. And you'll notice as you go through your days that there are names that you struggle over or trip over. Just have a mindful moment at the end of the day and just go back and think, is there anybody who I need to go back and clarify that with? Because I think that's a really good, important piece of practice. The second, I've spoken a little bit about our explicit curriculum, where we're directly teaching about inclusion and diversity. But there's a lot in the curriculum where you can be teaching in a diverse way simply through the things that you use to represent your curriculum. So a good example of this is in our school, we have a daily reading session through a system called Destination Reader. I think it's a really great program. And part of that is that when we're approaching a new chapter in a book, we will pick out some pieces of language, some vocabulary that we know children will struggle with. And we usually put them up on the screen, and we'll have a picture as a clue for each one. And then we'll give the children a quick chance to discuss and then share the correct definition with them. Now, when we're putting together those slides, I can guarantee you that if you're looking for a picture to illustrate a mood, a feeling, a job, the first 2 or 3 pages of Google Images that you look up for that picture are almost going to be exclusively white people, probably able-bodied, and even without thinking, you will be guided towards using that stuff because it's the most easily available things. So we as a school are very careful that we spend time picking out pictures and representations that are reflective of our class, where they can see themselves in the materials that we're using. And we're really careful as well that when we're picking out new texts in general that don't explicitly or directly touch on inclusion, that we're using a broad range of authors, that we're trying to reflect different people's experiences through those texts, that we have texts with different sorts of heroes and protagonists. And finally, we also try to make sure that when we're putting together assemblies and other ideas like that, we are trying to pull together role models that reflect our whole school community, so that children again come back to that idea of seeing themselves reflected and represented in their own learning. Now, a lot of what I've just spoken about, the implicit messaging, is walking the walk of inclusion. So instead of just talking the talk, if you're doing the things that I've just spoken about, you will be having the chance to demonstrate that yourself. Now, my last two slides here are challenging ones, and they're not slides that have got any clear takeaways. In a sense, by being aware of them and by knowing about them, it will help you to reflect and hopefully guard against some of these things. So when I'm talking about reflecting inclusion in your practice, it's really worth being aware of some things that people do accidentally or unconsciously without thinking about it. So this is a slide from the Timpson Review. This was the Timpson Review of external exclusions and permanent exclusions. And if you look at this slide, this is a slide of the percentage of children from different groups who have been permanently excluded from school. And you can see some massive, statistically significant percentages sticking out there. So you can see that children from a Gypsy, Roma or Traveller background are much more likely to be excluded than their peers. Children from a Black Caribbean background, children on SEN support, interestingly, not so many children on education, health and care plans. I'd suspect that's because those children have got quite a bit more legal machinery around them supporting them. But you can see that unconsciously, nobody's setting out to exclude these children. It just happens to be that our schools are not always brilliantly shaped to meet their needs. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can fix that yourself, but I am suggesting that by being aware and by being conscious of that and of these broader pictures, you can reflect in your own practice and think about if there are any changes that you need to make. It's useful to come back to this stuff. Secondly, this person here is not me. I realise we've both got similar follicular levels. This is Professor Rob Coe. He's a fantastic educational researcher, and this is from a talk that he was giving about standardised tests. Now, during your teacher training, and indeed during your career, you will have lots of different opinions about standardised testing, whether that be SATs in primary school or GCSEs or other qualifications. And often the feeling about those is that they're sort of a little bit inhuman, and that it's almost like they don't take into account children's differences and differences of experiences. But the research from educational settings that has gone on really reflects something quite different, which is that when teachers are assessing their pupils' abilities and attainment, that there are naturally a number of strands of bias that are really easily picked out, and again, in statistically significant ways. So if you compare teacher assessments to standardized tests, then children with SEN, children with more challenging behavior, EAL children, or even children whose personality is just different from teachers, are favored in those standardized tests. In other words, when that child is not being looked at as this particular child in my class, but as an exam paper, some of those biases fall away. It would be easy to look at something like this and feel like you had to spend your whole time thought policing yourself. And honestly, this is something where people are aware of this and do work hard not to be biased, but this stuff often works at a completely unconscious level. And we're not just going to be able to fix it one day and say, oh, we're going to treat people better, or we're going to include some different algorithms to help us with this. The reason I share this and have spent some time talking about it with you is because awareness of this is important in protecting yourself against it and giving your best efforts to treat everybody equally and in an inclusive way. Now, I'm about to wrap up on the stuff that I've got to say here. I'd like to leave the last word to some of my children with a whole school project that we did in lockdown. So this was for Refugee Week in last year in 2020. And we decided that we wanted to come together to do a poem. And it's a poem by Neil Gaiman, a wonderful poem. He's a great worker for asylum seekers and refugees. And the poem is called What You Need to Be Warm. So I hope you enjoy it. And then after that, I do have a little bit of time for some questions. So I'm just going to try and screen share a different screen for a moment. Bear with me. I will just finish by sharing some children from my school and other members of staff as well.
A baked potato of a winter's night. To wrap your hands around or burn your mouth.
A blanket knitted by your mother's cunning fingers or your grandmother's.
A smile attached to trust as you walk in from the snow or return to it. The tips of your ears prick pink and furry. The tink, tink, tink of iron radiators waking in an old house. To surface from dreams in a bed.
Burrow beneath blankets and pillows.
The change of state from cold to warm is all that matters, you think. Just one more minute, snuggled up here, until you face the chill. Just
places we slept as children, they warm us in the memory.
We travel to an inside from the outside, to the orange flames of the fireplace. Or the wood burning in the stove.
Breathe ice on the inside of windows to be scratched off with a fingernail, melted with a whole hand.
Frost on the ground that stays in the shadows waiting for us.
Wear a scarf, wear a coat, wear a sweater, wear socks, wear thick gloves.
An infant as she sleeps between us, a tumble of dolls.
A kindle of cats and kittens. Come inside. Just safe now. The kids are boarding next to the full family of friends are there. They smile. Cocoa or chocolate, tea or coffee, soup or toddy, what you know you need.
A heat exchange. They give it to you, you take the mug and start to thaw.
While outside, for some of us, the journey began. As we walked away from our grandparents' houses.
Away from the places we knew as children.
Tears up as state and state. To stumble across the stony desert or to brave the deep waters.
While food and friends, a home, a bed, even a blanket become just memories.
Sometimes it only takes a stranger in a dark place
To hold out a badly knitted scarf. To offer a kind word to say, we have the right to be here. To make us warm in the coldest sea. You have the right to be here. 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 You belong here. You have the right to be here.
You have the right to be here.
You have the right to be here. You have the right to be here. You have the right to be here.
You have the right to be here.
You have the right to be here.
You have the right to be here. You have the right to be here.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I hope that's given you some ideas about our school, our lovely children and our practice here. And, you know, maybe this idea of becoming a school of sanctuary is something that you will take forward into your own practice and think about going into your new schools. We always hope to get more schools in the network. It's a great community of practice together. But I'm here and available for questions. I don't know how you want to do that or how you've done it in other sessions. So I'd be happy to take them from the chat.